My take on your research, as briefly as possible, is that this year more journalists are going to lose their jobs, but for the journalists who continue, it's going to be much easier to be accurate and entertaining, partly because of AI. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think there will be fewer journalists over time. So, clearly automation is a big part of the story. But I think there's also a lot of, positive new possibilities for journalism as well, in terms of, as you say, making the job more interesting, focusing on things that getting rid of some of the drudgery that previously they've had to do, which has nothing to do with journalism, and focusing on things that AI can't do. I mean, the truth is that AI is going to be able to do a lot of the things that journalists currently do better. So we really have to rethink what we want journalists to do and to be.
The other thing for this year is there's a bit of a reprieve, actually, because there are 40 elections in 40 democracies. And elections are great for circulation because people want to know what's going on and how to vote. So is that again a fair summary of your research?
Yeah, but I think it's temporary. I mean, these elections come around every 4 or 5 years in most countries, and people who are interested in politics have a little bit of a bump, and they come in for the news a bit more regularly. But what we also see, I mean, obviously we saw this in 2016, 2017 with the sort of Trump bump, and everyone I think is expecting a bump, but a much smaller bump this time. I think what's happened in that intervening period is obviously we've had COVID, but also just the nature of people's interest in politics we find in our research has just decreased. So, a bigger proportion of the people are essentially disenchanted by politics. They feel they've got no agency in the political process. And so, that bump, which will happen, I think is going to be much smaller than, 4 or 5 years ago.
Yes, I think everyone's aware of news avoidance and news fatigue. People are basically sick of bad news. What are the opportunities that you found by surveying so many publishers that are ways to counter that?
Yeah, I think I personally find it quite frustrating because we've been sort of banging this drum for about 5 years. We started measuring news avoidance in 2017, and in some countries it's almost doubled in that time. And what people tell us is they find the news media too negative, too sensationalist, too focused on sort of big stories around politics or wars, and they don't really explain the news well enough. They don't offer any sort of sense of agency or hope a lot of the time. So the opportunity, I mean, I think the diagnosis is incredibly clear. I've just been looking at a whole load of open comments from our survey 2024, which we'll publish in June. And everyone's just basically saying that same thing. But I think what you do about it is not obvious, partly because the business model depends on volume, depends on attention. So the news media, continues to essentially cover wars and politics and the things that they know are going to get loyal people to come. And at the same time, that is turning other people away. So the opportunities around better explanation, more relevant content, really adapting journalism to how audiences want it delivered in so many different ways now. And I think giving people that sense of hope and inspiration so that it's not just relentlessly negative the whole time.
Yes. About 18 months ago, we interviewed a person in Denmark who was leading a push for constructive news. Has that fed through at all in your research?
Certainly. I mean, the whole sort of solutions journalism, constructive journalism movement, I think you can call it a movement now. If you talk to people who are doing it, they are kind of real evangelists for change. And a lot of the solution stuff, started in the US. There's a lot of very good examples of that now. And in Denmark, they've sort of reinterpreted it as constructive journalism. They wanted to get away from the fact that you couldn't cover, stories, difficult stories. It was about how you covered those stories with a constructive mindset.
Yeah, I have noticed it reading pieces by Australian journalists here at home, and very often it's as simple as writing a story that's substantially controversial or negative because bad things happen, but then tailing it with a bit of positivity and by comparing it to something that's happened elsewhere that worked, that had a good outcome.
Right, but that's just like lip service to the. I mean, I think what happens in the UK and Australia have very similar sort of cultures, very strong sort of tabloid news cultures as well. You know, it has been about grabbing people's attention and sensationalizing to some extent. And I think what's interesting is particularly younger generations really don't relate to that. You know, they experience a lot of media through social media, where there's a lot of sort of more positive reinforcement. You know, ideas like, you know, feeds of positive news get a lot of younger people really engaging with that, because they see traditional news as either irrelevant to them or actually harmful to their mental health. And we have to take this seriously, because this is the generation that, you know, is coming through and is going to, you know, be wanting to take decisions, and we need to be informed around democratic elections.
Yeah, the huge challenge is how to fix that. I mean, I have read that it's not just a matter of people being more interested in regular publications as they grow older, but there's actually a switch off and they go elsewhere, like Reddit and other places like that. But what I'm not reading about is the solutions.
I think it's partly because the solutions are really difficult, and in some cases they go against how we have thought as journalists, in terms of, you know, things like impartiality or objective journalism. Just the way in which you maybe need to, you know, talk about nuance, you need length, you need context. And in some of the sort of shorter form platforms like TikTok, it is actually quite a difficult thing to take some of those values and make them work in a way that really engages younger people. So it's not just a question of, you know, getting a young creator and giving them a brand and say go and tell stories in that environment. It's more complicated than that, because, you know, if you are telling stories in a very brief way, you need to. It's almost more difficult actually than telling them in a long way. So I think one of the big things about this year is that I mean, short form video is becoming much more important in Reels, TikTok, YouTube Shorts. And I think publishers really need to get to grips with how do you take the values of journalism and make them work in that environment, because that's where most young people are spending time.
So just ending on a positive note, you've had an opportunity to research and think about this more than most people. What are the sort of the key bright spots for you for the rest of this year?
I think it's a pretty gloomy outlook for this year in terms of, and we've already seen that actually in terms of layoffs and ad-based business models. So the bright spots are really fundamentally about paid business models, which are going reasonably well, certainly for upmarket newspapers. And you know, they've been growing over time. They continue to grow despite the sort of economic downturn. So I think there is a future for more journalism that delivers value to either to, you know, big groups of people, or to particular niches where paid models is going to be the driving factor. And then I think beyond that, the positives are around areas of growth such as newsletters and podcasts. So, you know, we're not just thinking about websites and apps, which is where we've been for the last 10 years. There's actually now many more opportunities to create direct relationships and really engaging content.
Nic Newman, thank you very much, and all the best for 2024.
Thanks, Pete. Great to be with you.